Network Dojo.
Probably one of the more likely options that we're going to have from a guest experience is Central Web Auth for guests. And this is where we're going to involve the ICE really as the policy engine. It's the one hosting all the web pages. And we already talked about this on AirOS side, so it all remains the same. And the requirements to get this up and running are the same, but we're going to see some significantly different configurations for certain parts of it to get this to work. So we need the following basic things in the configuration to support Central Web Auth on our iOS-based devices. Number one, a Radius server that supports change of authorization. And the COA config is a little bit more involved than just checking a box that we were used to seeing in the iOS world. We need a redirect ACL. This is going to be written completely opposite of what we were used to in the AirOS world, so that's a big difference there. And then the WLAN really is the same. It's an open WLAN from a layer 2 perspective with MAC filtering turned on. ICE is the Radius server, TripleA override enabled with NAC. And so the WLAN config identical to what we're used to on the AirOS side of things. So nothing changes there, exact same types of settings. So the big differences are going to be, one, we're configuring Radius within iOS, which is a lot more involved than what we saw in AirOS. And two, that redirect ACL is really the opposite. So let's go ahead and take a look at the configs. All right, we want to go ahead and focus on the CLI config here. I'm going to be honest, I'd be stumbling if I tried to configure it in the GUI itself. So practice this, get it to sort of a muscle memory type of phase. So I'm going to pretend that I don't have any config really up and running on Cat 3. There is a bunch of AAA stuff there, but I want to show you all the commands and steps from scratch. All right, first step, let's get all the AAA stuff configured first. So you would do a AAA new model to turn on AAA. And then we're going to do our Radius server definitions. So Radius server ICE with an IPv4 address of 10.0.1.5, auth port 1812, count port of 1813, and a share key and Dojo 123. They'll give you all this information, and you've seen me configure this multiple times before by now. So define your Radius server. Let's go ahead and get my server group. AAA group server Radius ICE with the server name of ICE. We're going to need some auth lists. So I do AAA authentication.1x ICE group ICE AAA authorization network ICE group ICE .1x system auth control. So the normal configurations that we would do for an AO2.1x style WLAN. Since we're engaging Radius, just do all the same exact configs as what we've seen on an AO2.1x style WLAN, at least from a Radius server perspective. And so up until now, you're not really seeing me do anything new that I haven't done before, but now we're going to do one extra thing, and that's the COA support. And so in order to do that, the command is AAA group server, flip that around, AAA server group, okay, you want it, server Radius, we'll get there, dynamic author. AAA server Radius dynamic author, and then we're going to call out ICE as a client. So client 10.0.1.5 with a key of Dojo 123. So the same IP address, server key. Same IP address, same shared secret as what we had in our global Radius server configuration, and then say auth type any. So let's kind of take a look at all of our AAA config to support this in one spot. Show run Radius.1x AAA. So Radius with COA support. A lot of lines of config to get us to that point. So let's just step through it one more time. Once I get my output here. All right, so we turned on AAA new model. We defined my Radius, I should have done section, section. One more time, then we'll get all the sub config that we want. There's a lot of extra stuff, so we'll just pinpoint the things that we really needed. Okay, so TripleA new model, turn that on. Define your radius server with the address, ports, and shared key. Create your server group name. Create your method list. We did the .1x authentication and the network authorization. We configured our dynamic author, that's the COA support, with the ICE server as both the client auth type of any, and we did .1x system auth control. So here's the radius server set up to support our Central Web Auth style WLAN. Okay, let's move on to the next part. The next part was a redirect ACL, and this needs to exist locally on the controller, and then the ICE overrides will reference the ACL name. It's just that the way that we write our permits and denies is pretty much 100%, 80 degree difference from what we saw in the AROS world. So I'm going to do a named ACL, IP access list, extended, redirect. Okay, so as we write our permits and denies, this is something called a redirect ACL. It operates differently than just a standard ACL you would apply, and it's different than a classic pre-auth style ACL. So it really does two main things. One, it does sort of a pre-auth style behavior where we say, what can we do prior to getting redirected to the ICE server? And two, what causes the redirection to our ICE server? And so as we write our permits and denies, anything that's denied does not trigger a redirect, and it should be allowed to happen prior to the redirect. Anything in an explicit deny rule. Whereas anything in a permit rule does cause the redirection to occur. And so think of all the services that we used to allow in the AROS world when we created this. Well, we wanted our client to pull an IP address, be able to do DNS resolutions, and be able to talk to the ICE server on the portal port. And so now we're going to deny those things because we don't want those things triggering a redirect, because if it triggers the redirect, they don't actually work. And then what normally would trigger the redirect is going to a web page, right? And so we're going to permit web traffic in our redirect rule so that when I try to go to a web page, on port 80 or whatever, that actually triggers the redirect and sends me over. So it's just flipped from what we normally experienced in the AROS world. So I would recommend, I'll show you just a really general ACL that you can configure that would work in any scenario, and then you can expand on it if you're asked to allow extra things or whatever. But I would sort of commit this to practice, do it like 5 or 6 times, and you'll get sort of ingrained inside of you. So how would I write this to just basically allow my client to pull an IP address, use DNS resolution, talk to the portal, and get redirected to it? Okay. So again, we're denying what we don't want to redirect. So we're going to have a bunch of deny rules. And this applies to traffic only coming from the wireless client. So deny UDP any equals boot PS. I've also seen people add boot PC, so if you just want to throw that on there, but normally I think it's just boot PS is all you need to worry about. So there's DHCP. Deny UDP any equals domain. There's our DNS. So this would allow a client to use any DNS server. If we only want to allow them to use a particular DNS server, then on the second part there, so it would be deny UDP any host the DNS server IP address, or a range of IP addresses, whatever it is. But let's just stay generic with it unless we're asked to be more specific. So we're preventing DHCP from triggering a redirect, hence it will work. We're preventing DNS from triggering a redirect, hence it will work. The last thing that we're going to deny is TCP from anything to the ICE server 10.0.1.5 on port 8443, which is the portal port. These are the things I want to work prior to the redirection, hence I need to explicitly deny them. None of these things will cause a redirect action to happen. Now I need to say, what do I want to cause a redirect to happen? So these are permit lines, and it's basically probably one of 2 things. So permit any equals port 80 or 443. And here's my ACL. Let's look at it all together now. Show run section access list. So I want to show it to you in the running config as opposed to just the show access list command. There we go. Okay, so here is a pretty classic redirect ACL. The only thing that you might not need in here is the boot PC. But if you can commit this ACL to memory, this works pretty much every time. Now it's very broad, so this works for clients on any VLAN. If they want you to be more specific, you might have to tighten up this rule, and maybe you're not saying from any IP address, maybe you're saying from the guest subnet. But from a redirect rule, it's not that big of a deal usually. So know this. So make sure DHCP works, make sure DNS works, and make sure that we can talk to the ICE server on the portal port, which is A443, which means we do explicit denies for them. And then we have the permit rules to say what does trigger the redirect, which should be port 80, port 443. If you look up documentation, you're going to see ACL is extremely similar to this in documentation. So practice this, commit this ACL to memory, and it won't be any big deal for you to do this in the lab. But practice it, because again, it's a little counterintuitive. It's opposite from a permit deny standpoint of what we're maybe used to and what logic might normally make us think for normal ACL type behaviors, but it's not a normal ACL. It's a redirect ACL. It behaves differently than what we might expect it to. Okay, so I've got my ACL. Last step, get that WLAN configured. So WLAN, we'll call it guest 1, pod 1, I'll say WLAN ID 5. All right, so this needs to be an open SSID with radius MAC filtering, TripleA override enabled, NAC enabled. So let's just go through it. I guess first let's drop the client off on a VLAN here. Let's say VLAN 111. No security WPA. This makes it an open SSID because by default we're WPA2 AES.1x. So I've made it an open SSID. Let's do the MAC filtering part. MAC filter ICE. So this references that ICE authorization network method list. Okay, so we've got the client VLAN, we've made it an open SSID, we've got MAC filtering, which is engaging ICE as our radius server. We need TripleA override, and we need NAC. And on the iOS devices, there's no difference between, there's no SNMP NAC or radius NAC. There is no SNMP at all. So it's just NAC, which is akin to saying radius NAC on an AirOS-based device. And no shut. Show run section WLAN. Let's take a look at the WLAN config in one place. Again, open SSID with MAC filtering sent out to a radius server, ICE. Get it here. We want TripleA override enabled, and we want NAC enabled. You can definitely go beyond this if they ask you to do other things too. Maybe they want you to turn on peer-to-peer blocking, maybe they want you to require DHCP, whatever it is, those are extra commands. This is pretty much the minimum needed to get Central Web Auth working. So again, commit this to memory. And so if you practice these 3 steps, radius with COA support, redirect ACL, configure your WLAN, you'll be able to blast through a basic Central Web Auth style configuration in the course of just a couple of minutes, honestly 2 to 3 minutes, and you've got a CWA WLAN all up and running on your iOS XE device. Again, you might go more than this from a config standpoint, but this is the minimum required configuration. And at this point, as long as ICE is configured to do everything right, we should be good to go. So let's go ahead and see it in action. All right, so let's disconnect from this, and we will connect to guest 1, pod 1. So I'm not anchoring right now. It's just being dropped off locally on Cat 3. That was not the one I chose, I don't think. Let's try that again. Guest 1, pod 1, how about that? And okay, so we're acquiring IP address, that's a good sign. Okay, so we've been dropped off on VLAN 111. So at least I know my redirect ACL is working well enough that I can at least pull IPs. Let's go ahead and see if I get redirected by going to a web page. I did. So I got redirected to the portal. And what the portal asks you to do, that's a completely separate section, probably task in the lab. And it's irrelevant from the switch's perspective. The switch is configured identically regardless of the type of portal. So it doesn't matter whether it's hotspot, self-registration, sponsor portal. You configure the controllers, the switches, exactly the same. But when we get to the ISI, we'll see how we configure it needs to be configured correctly to work with the switch. For instance, it's going to go ahead and push down the name of a redirect ACL. That name needs to match the ACL that exists on the switch, which I've already configured that appropriately. So let's go ahead and just get through this. I think my access code is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there we go. So I've completed the hotspot portal, at which point I should now be in a full run state. So if I try to go somewhere, again, I should not be redirected. And here I'm allowed to go to wherever it is I want to go, which means I should be in a run state. Show wireless client summary. State up. So we're not in a Central Web Auth pending state or anything like that. And so some things that can go wrong if you connect up and you can't pull an IP address or get redirected to the server, probably means there was something goofed up in the redirect ACL. And maybe it's fat finger of the name of the ACL, maybe it's bad rules in the ACL. If you're continually getting churned where you connect, you're on for a little bit and then it disconnects you and you connect and you're on for a little bit, that's really usually where you chose the wrong ACL name. Whereas if you chose the right ACL name, so you get connected and you just sit there and never pull an IP address, well, either you're being dropped off on the wrong VLAN or there's probably some bad rules. Okay, so let's say you get redirected, you get to the portal, you complete the portal, it says you're all good, you try to go somewhere and it starts you over again. That's a problem with your COA. We sent the COA event, we didn't get a subsequent authentication, and so you missed that dynamic author configuration and you weren't responding to the COA request. So a lot of things that can go wrong, but if you know those basic configs, commit them to memory, practice them 5 to 10 times, and you'll just burn through it, and it won't be anything to you to configure up a Central Web Auth WLAN down on your devices. So when we looked at the config here, it was just a single device. We weren't anchoring. What might change if we actually were anchoring this to somewhere else? Well, not a lot changes. The same steps mainly apply, but let's think about this in terms of authentication. Is this a layer 2 auth or a layer 3 auth? Well, it's layer 2 auth, it's MAC filtering. MAC filtering is a layer 2 auth. So all of the authentication requests will come from the foreign device, which means our MAs. And so I should expect the authentications to come from our MAs, not where we're anchoring to. And so that'll be one difference. And so it doesn't really matter, that's where the auth comes from. But in order to push the policy actually really pushes up to where we're anchoring, because our point of presence, our anchor, is where policy is applied, right? And for this policy to get pushed up to the anchor still needs radius configurations. The anchor must have the redirect ACL because the redirect ACL truly applies at the anchor, and so it's going to need to be, it must exist, it must have the proper rules, and it must be named the same. And then even though it really applies on the anchor, it still must exist on the foreign. And we saw this when we talked about this in the AROS world as well. We need the redirect ACL both on the foreign and the anchor. Same thing here, we need the redirect on the foreign and the anchor. But it's only the rules of the anchor that applies. So if you wanted to be lazy about it, I guess, and you could just say, you know what, IP access list extended redirect, and not put a single rule in it on the foreign controller, and technically it'll work as long as all the rules are there on the anchor controller. But you know what, You're going to be configuring it on both anyways, so copy paste, doesn't really take you much effort to put the rules in there, but technically you don't have to have the rules in the foreign, but it must exist on the foreign, otherwise it doesn't work. So same general sort of rules and philosophies apply to getting this working in an anchoring scenario on iOS versus anchoring this in an AirOS. Just make sure you're configuring both to basically work this whole thing out, and you're always safe. So if you configure the radius server with COA support on both the anchor and the foreign, you're covered. If you configure the redirect rule in its entirety on both the anchor and the foreign, you're covered. It's where you start potentially cutting some corners where you might run into some problems there. But absolutely works just fine in the anchoring. Those are some of the guiding rules to use for configuring it up in an anchoring scenario, as well as all the normal rules and recommendations for anchoring. So mobility group memberships up, the WLAN configured on both sides pretty much identically, and the anchoring configured. So combine all the recommendations and you should hopefully get a successful end result.